Good evening. Hello. Welcome to the V&A and welcome to Ways to be Public, conversation between Karen Burns and James Meek. This is part of the conversation series which forms part of All of This Belongs to You, our exhibition which is on at the moment until July 19. It's a show which seeks to ask what is a big public institution like this for? What is possible here that isn't possible elsewhere? How public is this space? How do the collections shape the kind of experience you can have here that you can't have anywhere else? This phrase, all of this belongs to you, which we've written in giant neon letters above the main entrance, is on one level so obvious as to be banal. As a national institution, of course, it all belongs to you, it all belongs to the nation, but we can't take this for granted. And tonight we're very lucky to have two speakers, the author James Meek and the architectural historian Karen Burns, who will together explore this terrain of publicness and its flip side, privatisation. As James's book so unflinchingly documents, our public institutions, from the Royal Mail, the railways, water, healthcare, and in particular from an architectural perspective, our homes, the whole monopoly board is being sold off by the government into private hands. How can we comprehend the structure and effects of the way these institutions are being transformed? These are global institutions, they're complex, they impact people in multiple different ways and over different time spans. Can we learn anything from looking? This is a museum of art and design, where aesthetic questions around objects are central to how we make sense of the world. Tonight, our two speakers will look, in a way, at the aesthetics of publicness, how these big abstract institutions hit the ground in the world and what we can understand about them by the way they look. First up, we'll have Karen speak. Karen Burns is Senior Lecturer in Architectural Design at the University of Melbourne. She's a frequent contributor to academic and professional journals, a critic, a public commentator of issues in contemporary architecture. And she is co-editor of Parlour, a website and discussion of exchange on women, equity and architecture. And this is a quick plug to Parlour, who are in the middle of a crowdfunding campaign to raise money to, to incorporate as a company. So, and yeah, it is an Australian platform, but as someone who has seen the rise of Parlour, it's made a huge impact on the scene over there on regards to women and labour. So it's a terrific pleasure to have Karen, and please make her welcome.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the curators very much for inviting me to talk tonight. It's a great pleasure to speak in this foundational Victorian institution. I walked in tonight, like many of you I'm sure, beneath this portal sign. Like a billboard evangelist, the sign promises to transform its viewers. Its message reawakens visitors' memories of being part of the public body politic, of being citizens from whom the museum is held in trust. But the museum sign is equally addressed to the institution itself. The ghostly spirit of a reanimated public life hovers over apparently inscrutable Victorian stonework. Institutions always change, even if their physical materiality seems to belie that. Change may be imperceptible or steady and incremental, and aesthetics can be one of the most important visible markers of these hidden transformations and one of aesthetics' significant functions. An electricity current flows through this sign, connecting the museum in unseen ways to the city. The neon circuit connects the museum into the city's electricity grid and thus into a realm of privatised or semi-privatised utility companies. But as I stood outside the National Gallery yesterday, the two seemingly distant worlds of public museum and privatised utility suddenly collapsed into one. I'm sorry I took this on my phone, it's a bad photo. 2 days ago I would have read the V&A's sign as a stirring call to reclaim electricity as a public utility. But after yesterday, I wonder if it's marking a new picket line in the contest over privatisation. Aesthetic forms, even forms like the pamphlet, which is designed in an aesthetic form, are complex like that. They produce meanings that escape their maker's control, and their meaning changes as the context changes around them. The hidden network relationship that I've discovered in the sign between the V&A and the electricity grid, or between the V&A and the striking workers at the National Gallery, characterises our times, because we live in a time of complex institutions, which makes tonight's topic very difficult. We live in a time of new hybrid organisations, of complex partnerships between governments, not-for-profit organisations and private companies. A network style of governance is one term that's been used to describe this phenomenon. State agency is now dispersed across multiple sites and organisations. But the polarising public-private binary that dominates contemporary life can obscure these complex networks institutions. As James observes in his book Private Island, flotation on the stock market is often presented as the only alternative for inefficient state organisations. So what I want to do briefly tonight is show you another alternative mode of institutional rethinking and the importance that aesthetics played in the institution's concerted program of renewal. It means I have to take you into the very deep past, which is 1975, and to the other side of the world, to Melbourne, Australia. The V&A's always been a museum of time travel. By 1975, the 40-year-old government social housing agency in my state, the Housing Commission of Victoria, had a serious image problem and some pretty poor relationship skills, serious enough to make a senior citizen take up arms against the state in this community pamphlet. Revisiting this archive is a useful cure for unbridled welfare state nostalgia, which bedevils some parts of our architectural discipline. The Commission was established in the 1930s and throughout the 40s and 50s built numerous low-rise walk-up apartments. All of these buildings are still in use. In the early 1960s, the agency embarked on a tower building program in order to clear large swathes of ground in a crowded Victorian inner city. The Commission undertook compulsorily purchase and demolition operations. It displaced families, residents and communities and closed schools, and another government agency demolished homes to make freeways. By the early 1970s, the ministry was under fire from very active and media-savvy citizen coalitions of local homeowners, and this included academics, architects and tenants' organisations. The agency was paternalistic, authoritarian, unobdurately modernist in its disregard for heritage. And it's useful to remember that the state was under siege from the left before it was under siege from the right. This is another useful thing about revisiting the archive. The agency's final death blow was an ongoing media inquiry into corrupt land deals. The Commission had been selling Crown land on the city periphery at cheap prices to developer mates who profited from the rising land value. So there was a Royal Commission, another inquiry, and then a 13-month review began. This inquiry was remarkable for its wide consultation with communities. For example, 17 households were surveyed, tenants' organisations were consulted. So in 1980, a ministerial green paper appeared which contemplated closing the agency, but it argued that housing was deemed too important for it to be stripped of its agency, and within 5 years, this is the kind of housing stock the new Ministry of Housing, as it was renamed, was building. The Green Paper stated that repairing trust in the social compact between government and community was extremely important, and I think this is a really important part of the partnership relationship. This compact between citizens and government was a key component of the agency's complete renewal. They changed their name, the key staff, the mission of the agency and its policy. The Commission was redesigned at every level, and within 5 years, its housing product acquired an entirely new form. So if you think about it, in 19 years, it goes from this to this. In line with the Green Paper's recommendations, the Ministry devolved itself of some duties like rent collection, it gave maintenance to the tenants' organisations, to focus on the complex functions of analysis, policy and planning. It recognised that housing and the housing market aren't merely functional. They're not just about shelter or economic speculation. Housing is a complex, changing ecology that requires a research and development organisation. And they were interested in financial reform and new models for underpinning the housing market, not just social housing. So they appointed an economist as deputy director. And then in 1982, they appointed an architect, John Devenish, to manage the rehabilitation and renews program. He aspired to make the organisation, quote, lead the market in housing innovation. Thus, one of the books they put out is a history of housing in the state, which includes social housing in the last part. So they're committed to a sort of revolution in shelter itself. Devenish recognised that changing family structures, migration patterns, inner city demographics and inner urban context required different housing models. So externally, the organisation's public identity as a civic authority was redesigned, partly through a media campaign. In 1983, a new Housing Act was introduced, and part of the agency's mandate was to promote public awareness of the role and functions of the public housing sector. That's a quote from the Housing Act from the piece of legislation. So there was an extensive publication and media program, including the curation of an exhibition for school children. This is the exhibition. There are other branding and media campaigns which I haven't investigated yet. I haven't quite got to the bottom of this one. I'm not sure I want to, although Rory particularly loves this slide. There were many policy innovations that were given aesthetic form. For example, the Ministry had a stated aim to, quote, deinstitutionalise its architecture, to jettison the image of cheap austerity architecture as the model of social housing. So this block that you can see before you was actually a 1950s walk-up, which has been renovated to aspire to look like something like Celebration, the Disney Newtown in North America. And often as part of their literature, they would include a sort of brief history of resident protests against the former Housing Commission, examples of the housing stock that they were renovating. So there was a conscious attempt to distance itself from the former organisation, and through these sort of public acts of contrition and disavow, remake itself. So instead of what it called institutional architecture, the Ministry focused on the image of the individual home and on diverse housing models, from clustered groups of renovated 1950s walk-ups. So you can see here they've got a kind of patchwork estate that they've inherited, and then they've got this infill program. So in that, there are a number of different housing models. This is one of the streets. So it concentrates on the image of the individual house and on diverse housing models, from clustered groups of renovated 1950s walk-up apartments to single terraces to rows of terraces. And in part, the aesthetic signalled the aspirations of the 1983 Housing Act for the Ministry to assist tenants to full or partial home ownership. So this was written into the Act. This was part of a social policy that recognised the role of property assets in fostering social mobility, particular intergenerational mobility, which is what property assets can do. This policy did not include, I stress, a policy of selling off and privatising public housing. As well as focusing on the image of the individual house, the Ministry focused on the street and the neighbourhood. So they had this aesthetic and spatial strategy which allowed the Ministry to pursue a key policy aim, which came out of research on the failures of earlier estates. And this was to integrate social housing into the neighbourhood and avoid creating social isolation and stigmatisation. And I think this is part of a larger project that I'm doing, looking at the way in which government agencies in Australia took up postmodern architecture. And this is partly because the aesthetics of postmodernism were so strongly focused on place. Buildings were stitched into the area through quotations from local building stock. So here is the spectacular architectural photographer shot, And here it is on the front. This is just to remind you that the buildings are actually quite ordinary, but they can be made to look more surreal. So these buildings created new places and produced an image of local place to suggest the longevity of communities and to make the image of the local and place the agency's mode of governance. So this is a time in which the neighbourhood becomes the unit of governance for the state. Here's another example. So the Housing Act of 1983 allowed the agency to enter into partnerships with local and regional councils and housing co-ops, and this is how this mode of neighbourhood governance was also transacted. It was able to hand over small holdings of social housing to local housing associations and put money into the new housing cooperatives. It began partnerships with not-for-profit housing organisations. This was a way for co-ops to become social housing providers and also for local councils to leverage their ability to borrow money. So the ministry was a government agency that was committed to a hybrid organisational form and to hybrid economic models. It was given a provision to contract out work to design and construct companies or to private architectural practices such as Greg Burgess's, as well as using in-house designers. So it was given enormous flexibility in economic structures and means of delivery. I say it was given, but basically the people inside the agency invented this. And gave it a flexibility to respond to differing circumstances, which I think is a really important part of the model. Very sadly, this extraordinary experiment was felled in 1989 by a banking disaster in the wake of the 1989 financial stock market crash. But the buildings survive, and the research project that I'm leading wants to revive an understanding of this extraordinary example of institutional renewal. It has left some heirs though, one of which is the Port Phillip Housing Association. This was a co-op that was started in 1985 and it was in partnership with the ministry. It's a not-for-profit organisation, so it channels funds from various government agencies and land or financial donations from local councils. And a local Melbourne practice, MGS, have been involved in providing housing design for this organisation. I'll just quickly whiz through this. This is one project which is a rooming house. These are former rooming house residents. Maybe the term here would be boarding house residents. There's also social services provided inside the facility to help people deal with a number of issues, so sort of very pared down accommodation inside. So these are sites that are donated by the council. Here's another recent one in Kime Place, Port Melbourne, which is also a rooming house. So both these projects have a kind of institutional image, which is the big house, not the individual house. So these are shared housing arrangements and people really live in sort of 1 or 2 room apartments. This site was a car park owned by the local council, so they donated the air rights to the site and they built over those, which meant that the cost of the building was 75% below normal price. And another quite different example is an interior, which is a recent project in Chapel Street, which is affordable housing and market housing, so 2 separate apartments. So again, this organisation has a sort of mix of styles and architectural models. So this is part of what I would argue the ministry bequeathed, a legacy of diversification and flexibility in spatial range, aesthetics and finance models. These buildings from Melbourne image inner urban and suburban places, promote location and community as the basis for a civic compact. We never stopped being postmodern in Melbourne. We've got the internet, we know about the other things, but this has been a very sort of important aesthetic mind to continue to hone. Today's contemporary hybrid organisations, I'm winding up now, can be positive, I think, as well. They can be versed in local issues, work with multiple groups and organisations, move across organisational boundaries, focus on consensus and offer flexibility. Diverse aesthetic choices can signify this flexibility and responsiveness to local issues. As the British academics Janet Newman and John Clark argue, we live in a time of both declining publicness and proliferating publicness, new forms of publicness, including a renewed engagement with what the public means. So one of the questions that we might take up in the conversation is, what does that verb belong in the phrase "all of this belongs to you" really mean? Is it a question of ownership, or is it a question of partnership? Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. Terrific and great to see some of those familiar sights. Now, to introduce James Meek, he's an author of fiction and non-fiction. His works include McFarlane Boils the Sea, Last Orders, Drive Time, The People's Act of Love, The Museum of Doubt, We Are Now Beginning Our Descent, and The Heart Broke. He is currently contributing editor of the London Review of Books, and his series of incredible essays documenting the story of privatisation of public assets has been compiled into his latest book, Private Island, Why Britain Now Belongs to Someone Else. And it's this word, as Karen concluded, belongs, which is really the heart of why we invited James, and we're thrilled to have him here tonight. So please make him welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Is that all right? Yeah. I'm just going to... Is this your computer?
No.
Oh, right. Okay, great. Well, I'm going to use it as a kind of lectern, a very expensive lectern here for my slightly scuzzy notes. I'm going to read to you an extract from my most recent article for the London Review of Books, which involved me going to Grimsby. The reason I went to Grimsby was to write about why UKIP was becoming quite powerful in the north of England and what the Labour Party, which traditionally is the main party there, was doing about it. But over many years of writing about privatisation, my eyes and ears become attuned to certain ways of seeing. And so that informed the way that I wrote the piece. I should say, just by way of, not by way of introduction, but by way of digression, that I finished that book. I'm not planning to write more pieces about privatisation explicitly, and I'm now working on a medieval novel, a novel set in the Middle Ages, which in the face of it seems as if it couldn't be further away from writing about privatisation in the late 20th and early 21st century. But in fact, perhaps because of this tuning, I do see the echoes of what's happening now back in the Middle Ages, and particularly in the Reformation, in the way that there was a time when the public space, the ecclesiastical space, the church space, it was very much controlled by the rich and the powerful. And yet, so often, they were rich and powerful who, in some way, in some sense, shared their riches, if only visually, with all sectors of society. And one of the reasons, we know that, of course, that one of the main reasons for the Reformation was the church had become tremendously rich and powerful. In some ways, it was a kind of privatizing agency. But at the same time, one of the reasons for the resistance to it was that it was a taking away of the common space of expenditure and ostentation and glorious shapes and patterns and portrayals, taking that away from everyone and moving it gradually, subtly, sometimes not so subtly, into private homes and private spaces. A process that really has never stopped ever since then, until it was, to some extent, revived by the municipality, the municipal-focused socialism and the national socialism, if you'll pardon the expression, of the 20th century. Anyway, back to Grimsby. In Grimsby, once, the world's largest ice factory would turn out gargantuan ice blocks to be crushed by the ton, carried on conveyors to the dockside, and poured from chutes into the holds of the world's largest fishing fleet, queuing up for the means to chill their catch before heading for northern waters. When the ships came back, they'd bury the quayside in haddock and cod. That was until the 1970s, when Iceland closed its fishing grounds to the British, and European politicians mutualised Europe's seas, including those Britain laid claim to, and told the Grimsby fishermen there weren't enough fish left. They could only catch what they were allowed to catch, and when. Boat by boat, the fishing fleet was scrapped. Freeman Street, the backbone of the town, darkened. It is still a desolate place. The ice factory is still standing, its machinery intact, but the conveyors are rusting. And although English heritage has given the vast red brick building a Grade 2 listing, this hasn't prevented the roof falling in. Since the ice factory roof dominates the skyline, the visitor gets the impression the docks have been freshly bombed. Grimsby has the 23rd worst unemployment rate in the country. 1 in 10 Grimbarian men is on the dole. For those in low-paid work, the introduction of 0-hours contracts and agencies are turning pensions, paid time off, and job protection into luxuries. Grimsby has a hope. It hopes to become to wind power what Aberdeen became to the North Sea oil industry. Wind power could give Grimsby back a sense that seemed lost forever, a sense of the sea as its domain. In cost and scale, the North Sea Round 3 wind farms are a £10 billion plus enterprise, a kind of moonshot against climate change. But the established parties have, in the name of no disruption, good stewardship, engineered a disruptive transformation in the way power is exercised in small English towns like Grimsby. A change so massive and so gradual that neither the politicians involved, nor the citizens of those towns, nor even those exercising the power, are ready to admit that it has happened. The great abdication in Grimsby has been of power itself, local power, that essential trinity of access to resources, inspired ruthless marshalling of effort, and care for what local people think. There's an abundance of autonomy in Grimsby, but local autonomy is not the same as local power. In Grimsby, you can see the effects of 2 old disruptions that had unintended consequences. Margaret Thatcher hoped that privatisation would create globe-straddling British companies owned by small British shareholders. But instead, most of the privatised firms and their small shareholders have been bought out by foreign governments and overseas pension funds. Thus, Associated British Ports, which owns the port of Grimsby, as well as many others around the country, used to be publicly owned, then was owned by anyone with the means and the desire to buy its shares on the stock market, and is now 1/3 owned by the government of Singapore, 1/3 by the pension fund of former municipal employees of the Canadian province of Ontario, and with 1/4 just bought by the Canadian National Pension Fund, and the remaining 10% snapped up by a British investment house, Hermes, which, as somebody pointed out, is actually the pension fund of British Telecom. The second disruption was the set of changes brought about by Blair's Third Way. These were supposed to force new ideas into health, education, and social housing. Instead, they were seized by the Conservatives in 2010 as the vehicle to separate the welfare state from the state that created it. The NHS and the education system have been split into autonomous, commercialized units with incentives to merge and form chains. Housing associations are simply starved of cash to build homes. In Grimsby, in Anthony Crossland's old constituency, the comprehensive school is no more. Each of the area's 10 state secondary schools has become an academy. 6 are part of national chains, administered from offices in Birmingham, London, Leeds, or Grantham. It's not that they might not be doing good work, some of them are, but they're part of a landscape of local political power entirely different from the one election candidates and the media speak to, the one citizens still believe exists. For most people in Grimsby, when something big goes wrong, blame goes to the government or the council. Along with the fragmentation of power is the hulking presence of Associated British Ports, known to all locally as ABP. The issue, as the head of Grimsby's main housing association told me, is ABP's control of the waterfront. It locks the community away from the sea. A private landlord stands between the public and the medium of its livelihood and culture. The Free Burghers of Grimsby got their charter from King John in 1201. That's burghers with an H. But the original harbour silted up in medieval times. The town went into decline, and by the 19th century, it was a notorious rotten borough, with a few hundred hereditary freemen choosing 2 MPs. The great fishing boom and the current shape of the town dates back only as far as the middle of the 19th century, when the Manchester, Sheffield and Lincolnshire Railway Company laid a line through the marshes and built the grand network of docks, linking the mouth of the Humber with the River Freshney. Today, the decaying streets of East Marsh lead straight to the acres of desolation of the ice factory and its environs. Near the factory are streets with handsome, damp, cracked frontages of dark brick, with boarded-up windows and weeds growing out of the gutters. The odd puff from a smokehouse chimney or pile of polystyrene fish boxes shows where commerce persists. But the general atmosphere is of a place waiting to host the final shootout scene of a 1970s cop drama. It's a strange thrill to look up at the street signs, see they have the ABP logo on them, and realize I'm on ABP territory. They look like public British streets, but they're private. Am I even in Britain? Or am I in a globalist anomaly, 1/3 Singapore, 58% Canada? ABP says the doubly privatized company is good for Grimsby and good for Britain. And yet, somehow, the government of Singapore still owns the port of Singapore, and the Canadian state still owns the ports of Canada. ABP, which has a virtual monopoly on the Humber, Britain's busiest trading estuary, recently went all the way to Parliament to try to block an entrepreneur's plan to build a new port near Immingham to stage the turbines and masts for the Round 3 wind farms. ABP's local manager told me he has £500 million to spend on new projects in the Humber, but his position as steward of one of Canada and Singapore's far-flung estates does not permit him to set money aside to mend the roof of the ice factory. There's a popular idea in Grimsby, as in so many other small towns across the country, that what is needed, all that is really needed, is jobs. Something will open, bringing jobs. Something will close, and jobs will be lost. Jobs joy, jobs gloom. Nothing must be done to destroy jobs. Everything must be done to attract jobs. Jobs has nothing to do with the job you actually have, or the job you want but can't get. Jobs is the magical key to communal contentment, to Freeman Street lighting up with chain stores, to nice clothes and holidays and happy children. For sure, the town is desperately in need of work. But there is a problem with the jobs obsession, and not just that so many of the jobs are low-paid, low-skilled, insecure ones. There were plenty of jobs during the 100-year fishing boom. At least that's what the people of Grimsby say. Certainly, fortunes were made by successive trawler owners. And yet, it's striking how little mark all those jobs and all that capital left on the landscape in terms of great buildings or the endowment of institutes or galleries. Those who grew rich, bought farmland, moved away, sent their children to private schools, got the smell of fish out of their clothes. In his book, A New Kind of Bleak, Owen Hatherley describes how, during its fishing boom years, Aberdeen almost bankrupted itself with grand architecture and elaborate cultural legacies. Yet, in the 35 years since Aberdeen became the oil capital of Europe, the city has not seen a single worthwhile building in the city centre. Grimsby was left with much less than Aberdeen from its fishing days, and risks having the wind power boom rush through without bringing anything to the city more rich and lasting than jobs. An effort by a local trust to save the ice factory by buying it from ABP and turning it into an art gallery and cinema foundered when the Heritage Lottery Fund turned them down. On Freeman Street, the hereditary freemen, they still exist 8 centuries after they got their charter from King John. They still own the freehold in most of the shops on the street that bears their name. They've renovated the market with the EU's help. The council's installed new lampposts. Everyone understands they're just pecking away at the rot, and that only a determined, well-funded and imaginative vision to transform the entire area and bring the docks and the town together will succeed. But with the local arm of the state, the council, weakened by third way disaggregation, with ABP essentially a buy-to-let proposition run by absentee landlords in Toronto and Singapore, and with no sign of the kind of buccaneering local capitalists who built the docks in the first place, this looks impossible. Rising high above the docks is the one great monument in Grimsby to the old power of local capital, the Grimsby Dock Tower. It was built in 1852 for strictly utilitarian purposes as the container for a hydraulic system that opened dock gates and operated cranes. The ingenuity of its design was necessary to its function. The beauty of its appearance was not. It was built as a copy of the Torre del Mangia in Siena, but has a ruddy Hanseatic simplicity, quite in keeping with the North. It was a boastful flourish added by businessmen who were around on the local scene, who cared what local people thought of them, who wanted to impress and awe. The tower remains. No such route to public magnificence exists today. ABP has no reason to perform that kind of boast because Canadian pensioners have no reason to boast to the people of Grimsby. Toronto and Singapore want neither to help East Marsh nor to have the mighty of Grimsby look on their works and despair. They just want their 5% return on equity as smoothly as possible. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, James, for unpacking that terrific article and for telling us about your latest project, which seems to have some peculiar parallels with the medieval world. I was in particular struck by this person, this director of ABP, with £500 million to spend in Grimsby, who's unable to fix the roof of the ice factory. But somehow the system which devises the context in which people live has been completely severed from that context, as the example you concluded with demonstrates. How can we, perhaps there's I was going to draw a connection with your talk actually, Karen, that somehow the reinvention of Melbourne's housing authority was driven by this idea of context. It turned away from these monolithic modernist blocks and invested in an architecture that was specific to the place. Can we, of course, that in the 1970s it predates globalisation in many ways. Can we turn the clock back? Is there a way to somehow connect these two ideas? Is there a solution for Grimsby in architecture? It sounds very timid in the face of the powers you describe, but perhaps there's a link there.
Is that for me?
Well,
I'll go first. Yes, you write a book and then they come at you for answers. It's very uncomfortable. Well, I mean, I have a general position because I've done a lot of events like this after the book came out, and so people do keep asking, what should we do? And I was thinking, whoa, I wasn't expecting that, but I have thought about it more since then, and I do think there are steps that can be taken, but it really starts with a kind of philosophy of what kind of first of all, you have to understand the country that we have created through a succession of unintended consequences. And then you have to set up an alternative philosophy that is a reaction to that, without, and I appreciated that you kept referring to this, without idealizing the welfare socialism of the peak years of the 70s. And I think it does begin with making a distinction between ownership and control and an operation that you can bring private capital in, and you probably should, and you can certainly bring expertise from all over the world, genuine investment, rather than simply this kind of absentee landlordism, which is what the privatization of so much of Britain has become. It's become a sort of tax farming, where you have these remote agencies. And I must say, no, it's not your fault, but a very large percentage of the absentee landlords are in Australia.
It's our revenge.
Yes, it's your revenge. I mean, you have the Australian pension funds, but you also have these big agencies like Macquarie in particular. They are the sort of middlemen who are standing between these. I mean, the great irony is so many of the ultimate investors, as they're called, investors is a misnomer, these absentee landlords, so many of them are pensioners who used to work for the state and have probably seen their own agencies privatized. And they are now collecting their pensions, quite innocent of the fact that the people that they have hired to invest this money are using it to exploit people in other countries. It may well be that there are British pension funds who are doing the same to Australian privatised utilities.
Is this good? Yeah. I guess there's two interesting points, and I've read the long version of the essay, so I feel like I know Grimsby quite well and I can picture it in my mind. I guess one thing is supply chain politics. So, and the internet has been very powerful in that, in making consumers aware of what they're purchasing. So making those people who are now abstractly in Singapore and Canada aware of what the supply chain is in terms of ethical and non-ethical investment. I think that's been one quite successful avenue. And I think about that amazing sense of the ice factory, and it sounds to me like they were trying to solve too many different problems with one building. That maybe if you want a museum and a gallery and you hope it's going to create tourism and jobs, and then you're hoping you get money from the lottery fund, maybe start small. I'm thinking about an amazing scheme in Australia called Renew Newcastle, which was a port town, big ex-mining community, depressed in the centre, and an amazing man called Marcus Westbury started a sort of ground-level grassroots campaign of renewal through, and Rory knows more about this than me, through different leasing models to start with. So he started small on a shopfront by shopfront basis, and so start small. Don't try and solve too many problems with one building with all these other large organisations, is what I'd suggest.
Yeah, I mean, I see many examples around the country of communities trying to trying to overcome the obstacles that have been put in their way to make their cities better. And in my own home city of Dundee, I've spent sort of 40 years of my life watching the city sort of crawl inch by inch towards the water. There's this open space between the sort of the main streets and the waterfront, which they seemingly have found it impossible to cover. They've tried roads, they've tried a skyscraper. Now they've knocked everything down, they're starting again. It's taken 40 years, but it seems as if finally, with the help of the new Victoria and Albert extension, so perhaps the answer is for the Victoria and Albert to open an affiliate in every town in the country.
It's the Bilbao effect.
Yeah, the Bilbao effect.
Well, I'm going to take that point seriously to begin with, because I think it's an interesting and valid one. I mean, you in your original response, you seem to claim for a counter ideology to try to combat this, the effects of capitalism when they hit localism. And well, that's sort of what this place also set out to do. It's a generous institution. It's a public institution. It tries to revive a community through a specific building. But even now, it seems too simplistic against the types of forces that you're describing. I mean, I'm in particular thinking of the irony you set out in your essay about the railways, that the arguments for privatisation and liberalisation and competition that privatisation allows are undermined by the reality that the state railways in Britain are owned by other foreign states, by France, by Netherlands, by Germany. So these places understand the value of the state, and perhaps that's an ideology that needs to be promoted here. And I hope architecture has a role in that, but it seems like a blunt instrument in the face of such a monolith.
I think it would also be naive to pretend that it's not just about the kind of the top-down effect. It's also, there's a lot of individual resistance. I found myself thinking these sort of heretical thoughts as I walked around Grimsby and seeing these unbelievably ugly metal sheds just sort of planted in the middle of town where they were selling various big retail warehouses. I mean, even ugly by the standards of retail warehouses, things that are not going to last and are incredibly ugly. And yet, they're very economical and they bring the prices down. And I started thinking, yes, in the past, there was a certain amount of robbing people in order to give them things that they would never have been prepared to pay for if they hadn't been stolen from them. Perhaps it's only us, the middle classes of the 21st century, who are now enjoying the fruits of this robbery. I mean, these are very sort of dark thoughts, but what do you think about that?
I'm going to give you an answer from history, because I'm a historian. There was a book that came out in 1972 called Freedom to Build by a British architect called John Turner. It's a very interesting book. It's a sort of libertarian book and promotes that people should build their own housing. And he says that predominantly housing has been supplied by people who have an idea about the product that they should impose on others. So I think part of the way forward is through different kinds of dialogue. That it can't be an imposition either way. I think that's why my idea of partnerships and coalitions and conversations and inquiries is really important.
James, that's one of the things that's so striking about your work. In this essay referring to the Royal Mail, we're first introduced to a woman whose apartment is stuck full of mailboxes, which is a symptom of the way that deliveries have been reorganised. So we're given a picture of some well-meaning CEO in head office saying, we'll give opportunities to people who have a small amount of work or want to get some exercise, and they can deliver the mail. is this what Karen's describing, a way of understanding the bigger system at the top through the people whose living rooms and the boxes land inside?
Well, I mean, certainly that's the way I've always worked, is to sort of land somewhere and see the effects and work back from the effects to see the causes. I mean, I don't think I was really presenting a picture of an idealistic CEO. I mean, that was absolutely about cheapness, about an exploitation. Of course, they were presenting the idea of having very of this giving part-time work to pensioners and to students who needed a few pounds in their pocket. But really, what it was about was just taking a well-paid job with good salaries and benefits and pensions and turning it into the lowest low-wage form of labour with no infrastructure or overhead. So instead of sorting the mail in a building that the post office paid for, you would give the big boxes of mail to people, and they would take it home to sort in their kitchen or on their bed. And that's coming here. I mean, this same post office, the Dutch post office, they are now doing this in Britain. And the privatisation of the Royal Mail has only gone through its first stage, and in 10 years' time, it will be possible for this. It used to be called TNT. They've now changed their name to Whistle to make it sound more jolly. So that's coming down the road soon. Half-price postmen sorting the mail in their bedsits.
This is only coming because they're looking for the next profit margin. I mean, if the organisation was just trying to break even, it wouldn't have to kind of increasingly find ways to.
If it was public, yeah. Karen, I was really struck by this quote you had, which is, in Melbourne, we've never stopped being postmodern. And perhaps, can we understand this as being more than just aesthetic? Can we understand it as being about an embrace of the complex public-private partnerships? And is perhaps that the way forward, if we accept the terrain that we're given and learn to play that game better?
I think we have to, because I don't see an ideological revolution coming soon in my lifetime. I could well be proved wrong. So I think we have to invent new models of working. It doesn't mean giving in, but in the meantime, I think, and there are people who do it, there are ways forward. I think the Newcastle model is a really interesting model, and the local housing associations in Melbourne, and I think the work of documenting the privatisation that's going on is very, very important. And then, as well as contesting that, then in the meantime, we also have to find other models to work with.
I don't think it needs an ideological revolution. It simply needs a cool and unprejudiced view of the way that things are working, and a willingness to embrace the many models in Britain and around the world which are not simply privatisation and are not simply the way many big state organisations used to be run, namely as a branch of central government or local government. I found myself, as I reached the end of the work on this privatisation project, I found myself sort of understanding where Labour were when they came to power in 1997, and just being so bitterly sad and angry that they didn't fully understand the implications of what they were doing. So the idea of academies, the idea of housing associations, and even the idea, I know this is very controversial with a lot of people on the left, even the idea of NHS trusts, I don't think they're necessarily bad. The problem was that the people who were designing the introduction of these agencies were in many cases the business people who wanted them to be as commercialised and as near to privatised and as ready to be turned into chains as possible, so that they could benefit. Labour's problem was that it didn't understand that unless you put triple locks on all these agencies to prevent them being over-commercialized, to prevent them being turned into sort of sausage factories for the middle classes, giving them the appearance of good service, while a small number of people benefited. Unless you put explicit preventative measures in place to protect these new structures, then they would be exploited by businessmen who have nothing better to do all day than to sit and work out how to get through a loophole.
I mean, the NHS is a great example because, in a way, it's become politically untouchable. There's so much, well, seemingly...
It's not politically untouchable at all. They say it is politically untouchable while touching it in a very damaging way.
Well, I guess I'm trying to compare it to something like social housing, which, yes, we see resistance to its being selling off and its privatisation, but there is still a broad idea that these are freeloaders, that they should go and work for it. Whereas the NHS feels something more difficult to privatise, perhaps. I'm trying to bring it back to Karen's lovely slide of two gentlemen in tracksuits with the words, "I'm here to help," and Ministry of Housing written on them, which to me is something that I could really get behind. It's something that might make me inspired by the Ministry of Housing and the work that it does, carrying prams upstairs for young mothers. How can we inspire the same kind of belief in these public institutions, like perhaps we have, and I do think we have in the NHS, despite its constant erosion, for other departments like health, or like housing, or water, or electricity, or rail. Tracksuits?
You have to appoint really good, clever people. I mean, that's why I wanted to talk about that project of institutional renewal. They appointed really smart people who undertook a long period of consultative research with their client communities. And there's probity, there's financial probity, which is your triple lock image, involved in those appointments and in the responsibility they have to pursue a new agenda. So there has to be probity and transparency, and there has to be an interest in recruiting the best possible people to reinvent the organisation.
How do we evaluate the motives of these people? Because as James mentions, these in many ways are the best people. They're the people who run the banks, who understand these systems, get to design these systems, particularly the economic ones. How do we get people?
No, they're not the best people. They're very clever people, but they're not the best people to run services, because they're one of the great problems of the way that this country has now become structured is that so many of the organisations that are there to provide essential services are now facing in two directions. They are answerable to their shareholders before they are answerable to customers. So you'll see this very jolly, cheerful, smiling faces website. Aren't we wonderful? It's all happy and beautiful in today's sunny England. And then somewhere in there there'll be a link to the company report. And the company report is all about how much money we are screwing everyone for, and how big your profits are, how large your dividends are. We're driving costs down, we're cutting staff, we're making new efficiencies. Everything's great. So that's the contradiction, and that is not the way I feel to. Everyone really wants to get the best people. It's a question of how you keep tabs on them, how you actually exercise the ideal of consultation. There was a very interesting situation going on in Grimsby, which unfortunately I didn't have time to put in the article, didn't have space because it was an incredibly long piece. But they've done something there with the local health service, which this isn't what they call it, but I would call it a kind of sort of an elective democracy. So if you sign up, if you take an interest, you can put yourself forward as one of a group of thousands of people who will then have a kind of vote which will elect a smaller group of people, which in turn will elect representatives who sit together and kind of triangle. There'll be a medical specialist, there'll be a managerial specialist, and there'll be you, the voice of people. And the three of you will sit down and work out problems together. Now, this idea of tackling the incredible complexity of these modern structures, which is why usually you call for the bankers, by bringing together these small groups of people who have agreed that they are interested in something, they are able to spend the time to get to know it. That seems to be a possible way forward. The only problem is, what has this organisation actually been doing? They've been finding out ways to cut stroke services in Grimsby Hospital. So there you have this great idea of participatory elective democracy in the health service, and it's being used as a tool to implement government cuts. So it's frustrating. But I see something there.
Yeah, I'll just answer really quickly because I know you probably want to open it up to the audience. I think one is the value of expertise. That's really clear in your essay on the National Rail. They stripped out all of the specific rail expertise, so those people weren't there to present the alternative to the business case, to pick the business case to pieces. And the other is, if you have an organisation that's diverse, you don't have this horrible word groupthink. You've got different forces contesting against each other and asking questions. There are ways to build in organisational complexity and design organisational systems where there's accountability within the organisation, because people are representing different interests within that organisation and bring different expertise to the table.
Yeah. We're going to open up for questions. So, have we got any hands in the room? Here we go.
You mentioned the banks and private organisations. If this became V&A Inc., I suspect my pleasure of coming here would hit the floor, because it would all be costed, and the staff would be, the people at the top would be trebling their wages, and the people at the bottom would be half of them, and people wouldn't be happy. And you walk in here, it's great. It's all free, and you do stuff which is a bit quirky, like this private space thing, which is, on a cash sense, is worthless. It's great, I love it. But V&A Inc. would charge me for it, and it wouldn't be any good, and somebody would have costed it, and you'd end up with the Millennium Dome, which eventually you'd give away because it was rubbish. And this is good because it's not a business. It's not got a bottom line. It does have a bottom line, but it's not. It's a service rather than how much.
Well, perhaps I'm not going to pretend to speak for the V&A because I'm not qualified to, but I'll try to be provocative rather than defensive. Perhaps it is a bit V&A Inc. around here. You know, this event tonight's free. The things you passed on your way up to this gallery, this room, were free. But downstairs we're selling tickets to Alexander McQueen. We're selling books, we're selling merchandise, and we're selling space for rent in the evenings. But somehow the big idea of the V&A and what it means to the public and the idea of a free institution can maintain in that balance. And I think that it's about that balance and making sure that money spinning generation doesn't drive the rest of the organisation and its public message. Does that work?
Well, yeah, I mean, I have a couple of thoughts on what you said. I mean, one is, I'm not sure that I mean, it's not free. I know it's not free. You know it's not free, in the sense that the people who work here do have to be paid. They give it their time, they give it their sweat. And I feel that in defence of the idea of the public realm, I'm not sure how helpful it is to start saying it's free, because I am proud to live in a country which is prepared to spend actual money to maintain a place like this, that supports the idea that everyone should pay a little bit to sustain things like this. My other thought is that I feel it is being eroded. And what I see in places like the V&A is what I see all over the country. And I see in the park, the beautiful park on my own doorstep, which is, you have a museum where you don't have to pay to go in, have a park where you don't have to pay to go in, but we will have a rock festival, which you have to pay £50 to get into. On this weekend, and on this weekend, and on this weekend, we'll lease large areas of the park to film companies to film, so you won't be able to have access to it. It's that kind of creeping commercialization of the space. And it's not so bad in the V&A. It's a wonderful institution. Try getting anywhere without going to the gift shop, the seemingly increasingly large gift shop. And the cafe is not particularly obtrusive, but there are a large number of museums around the country I've been to. I'm thinking of the gallery in Leeds, where you feel that the gallery, it's become almost an afterthought, and the main thing is the coffee shop. The coffee shop is teeming with people, and they're chopping back their lattes and eating their cakes. And then you go through, you can find the door, you might go to the gallery, it's completely empty apart from a few school parties going around. So it's great, but it's perilous, is what I feel.
Karen?
I'd probably take it on a case-by-case basis. I'm not sure that some commercialisation is the beginning of the slippery road to the end. And the expansion of museums into the cafe retailing sector has been going on probably since the 1970s. It's been a long time coming.
Well, this museum is the first to have a cafe. So there's an innovation here.
And that was a 19th century innovation.
That was in the 1850s. Yeah.
And the first superintendent of this museum thought the museum should be self-supporting, i.e. not receive a financial subsidy from the state. So 19th century institutions were also complex institutions. The first superintendent was a laissez-faire man, believed in the market. The museum was set up partly to provide British design with better competition in international and local markets. So places have complex histories that move backwards and forwards. I guess that's my historian voice, talking about taking things on a case-by-case basis.
I do like this idea, though, that it may not be helpful to say that it's free, that somehow it's a test of your belief. It's a bit like the BBC licence fee, within the debate around that. Any other questions? Or Lauren?
Maybe.
Hi, I sort of want to follow on from the historian voice in that. One thing that struck me was this idea that the ideal social action, I guess, certainly in Britain, peaked in the 1960s, say, and then started to decline, certainly like the schism being Thatcherism. And one of the things that also struck me about that time was that was also the end of the British Empire, really. And that I wonder whether this idea that the public that we're kind of sitting in or maybe nostalgic about is because a lot of what Britain did was to outsource to do the reverse of what's happening now, is to outsource a lot of its income to be able to afford to pay for things socially at home. And I'm wondering, given that, how do we design for discomfort in history? That capital goes in and out, and in and out, and there will be times that the actions of 50 years earlier will have repercussions. And how do you design for that? And just take into account that, I guess what Karen just mentioned is that things flow in and out and decisions are made and that tremors happen.
I guess it's also what you decide to do financially at that moment. I mean, some people believe that the British Empire ended in 1945 with the end of India being part of the empire. But somehow my Indian friends who are post-colonial historians, that's part of the argument they have. But somehow Britain found the money to build the welfare state. So and they were incredibly poor at the end of the war. So somehow this choice was made about where money would be spent as well. So I think that's a very interesting historical example.
Do we need to design for discomfort? It's an uncomfortable idea, but I mean, it seems to me that the only welfare states which survive are the ones that are bolstered by minerals or external sources of income, like Australia or Norway.
When you say design for discomfort, you mean less money?
You mean austerity design?
No, I mean generally.
Recalibration.
Recalibration. I mean, there's a lot of things which flow from your very interesting point, and I absolutely agree. It's really good to take the long view and to think of flows, and it would be, for everything I've said, there is a certain charm in the idea of all these countries which used to be part of the British Empire, sort of buying up Britain, and making money out of us for a change. So yeah, there is something to be said for that. However, on the other hand, the thing which for me has changed since the 60s is not so much protest. Perhaps there wasn't quite so much protest then as we imagine now, and perhaps there's more protest now than we think. But it's more that the sort of the ideological framework of socialism is, putting it a bit bluntly, the ideological framework of fairness, I would say. This simple idea that society as a whole that members of society should pay a proportionate share of the cost of the things that go towards making a civilized country work. That seems to have been swept away. And that's, for me, the big change. Because you see these countries which have emerged from socialism, the obvious ones like Russia and China, and the less obvious ones like the countries of Asia and Africa and South America, which were so strongly influenced by Marxism in the past. They have now gone through this whole business of privatization themselves, but in a much more unequal way even than here, so that you have this tiny number of people who've become fantastically rich. So if it was the case that a well-run social democratic Russia, for example, which spent lots of money on healthcare for its own people, and spent lots of money on good transport links, and social protection and welfare. If that country was putting together a sovereign wealth fund and buying up big chunks of Britain, I wouldn't feel so uncomfortable about it. That's my problem.
I think we do have to face the issue of designing for discomfort, and this is the environmental sustainability crisis, which maybe gets swamped in the immediate discussion about privatisation, but that's a huge issue that we're facing. How are we going to deal with water infrastructure in the cities? How are we going to protect food sources? How are we going to deal with these huge cities that we'll be facing by the year 2050, where most of the population of the planet will be living in urban conditions, and which means that people will have to radically downsize the affluence of their lifestyles too, and that's a huge challenge that we face as designers, which is about asking people to trade off a degree of present-day comfort.
Do we have another question over here?
I have one. I'm a V&A person as well, but I was going to sort of back from the brink of ecological disaster and economic systems that we can't comprehend to just try to pull it a bit back to what an institution's made of, which seems to me nothing to do with whether you pay for it or not, or nothing to do with the absence or presence of commerce, but more to do with a kind of structured set of commitments. And we talk, one of the things about all of this belongs to you, the statement, both your presentations have made me feel it's more like a prayer than a statement now, which is probably a bit true. But we also think, as all relatively new people to an institution like this, that there's something valuable in that set of commitments. So there's something to which you're committed as a taxpayer who never comes to the V&A. You've never been to the V&A, but you've paid your taxes and you're somehow paying for it. There's an extra commitment to the person who comes. There's an extra commitment probably to the person who comes several times. Then there's a person who volunteers, there's a person who works here like us lot, and there's the director, and there's the culture department who funds us, and so on and so forth. And it seems to me that what's striking, and perhaps a weird model about the place like the V&A, and we're not the only one, is that those commitments are far more than financial. They're far more than what you would ever get back in money. So I'm interested in that, like what you seem to be describing of, we've asked the question in these talks previously, where is the next Carnegie? Where is the next person coming with money to endow public institutions? But isn't perhaps there a model in some of these institutions of the kind of commitments you're wishing were still there, the kind of just very general everyday commitment to something bigger than oneself that one still identifies in institutions like the V&A? And if so, can that be extrapolated, used as a model, made into some, one of our contributors says, what if we took care of people as well as we take care of objects? At the V&A, that sounds innocent and naive, but there's something in that, because there's a structure here that for 165 years has looked after objects extraordinarily well, and through a whole set of commitments that are not just commercial. That's my point.
That's partly what you're describing, isn't it, James? An ideology or a belief or a currency, a non-financial currency which we can get behind.
Absolutely, it's one of the things that I put in my book. This idea, and it was I spelled it explicitly, but it was also implicit in the actions of some of the characters that I met. I'm thinking particularly of this guy in Tewkesbury during the floods, who just helped people. He just walked around helping old people carry their water supplies when the water was cut off by this privatized water company for many days. And there wasn't anything the company could do about that. But what was outrageous was that they still charged everyone for the water that they couldn't use for all this time it was cut off. So people like that step in to the breach, and always will. But it goes beyond this sort of volunteering mentality. It's simply to try and push back against the ideology that has been very strongly promoted ever since 1979, which is that ultimately people only care about money, and they're only motivated by the paycheck or the chance of making a big profit on some deal, or when it comes to technology, it's only the prospect of the royalties from the patent that really drives them. Yes, of course, that's a factor, but the idea that people aren't motivated just as much or more by the kind of competition that is a sort of moral competition, or the simply doing good, or simply caring about people. I think it all comes back to this word care, that you care about what you do, not just because you're being paid to do it, and you care that other people care about how you do your work.
I guess it's very difficult when we talk in large terms, isn't it? I really appreciate Kieran talking about a particular institution, which is why I talked about two particular organisations as well, because otherwise we can end up making large, abstract comments. And I do think both the organisations I talked about, there's a huge level of commitment in them. One that's still very current, which is a profitable organisation that has a $300 million property portfolio, the social housing organisation, but it's really committed to local residents as well. And so I think, but commitment is a great, or belief, belonging, not the verb belong as in terms of property, but what kind of community do you belong to? Whether you belong to the V&A community, then you belong to the tax-paying citizen community as well, and how those different kinds of communities overlap and then might meet in a space like this as well, so that the institution draws different communities together, has a really powerful function in that way.
I was just going to bring it back to geography and place slightly, because one of the things that was reminding me in the conversation was about that ethical or moral sort of domain that went with Victorian philanthropy and the capitalist, manufacturing, which then built certain infrastructures that people would then inhabit, and they did it, of course, partly around profit, but also around some sense that they were, leading a certain sort of ethical. And the value seemed to be, to me, the dislocation that's happened is a sort of global complexity and dislocation. When that sort of financial system was operating in a world where you were geographically proximate, feels as if that operated better in the sense that people had an ethical link to the place that they were operating. Whereas as soon as you dislocate the ethical link to Singapore or Canada, there's even normal human emotions of not feeling. You don't know the people who are in Grimsby. So it becomes a much more selfish sort of. The sense is to be more selfish, or you can't help it, and it seems like that's part of the issue. It's not an answer, but it just feels like that bigger complexity has led to this ethical crisis. And I was listening to the person who directs the SESCIs in Brazil 2 days ago, and they are the social service for commerce institutions, of which there's hundreds around Brazil, which take £1 from every company for every employee and spend it on these amazing cultural centres. I mean, not like the V&A, but in other ways like the V&A, but there's sport and swimming there as well. So that's Lina Barbardi's Seschi in Pompeii. It's one of the classics. And that was a really interesting model because, of course, it's a different cultural. It's a country that's still been able to grasp some sort of control. But I mean, what a country if it's been able to maintain since 1946 the Seschi system to give everybody free access to cultural, completely democratically. And you wonder why that, how that ethics has existed within Brazil of all places. And I think it's about the protocols and, the probities of certain links and blockages. I mean, by not allowing people to forget their ethical boundaries, maybe, through law or other functions.
That's a fantastic example, Mel, because it's operating on the scale of a nation. I mean, the example you give at the end of your talk, and I love this idea that the good people of Grimsby who built the tower and the docks cared what local people thought of them, and that somehow this motive made them make something beautiful.
And it might have been really unpleasant motives. I mean, they might have cared what they thought of them in the sense of, we want you to know how rich we are and how clever we are. Not necessarily very attractive. But I mean, it works, I think, on a smaller scale as well. And there's no better example of that than in public housing, because I'm sure it's the same in Melbourne. I'm telling you, if it's not, that one of the key issues for public housing is the degree to which those parts of the community who do not rely on subsidised housing are able to or wish to feel that it's not their problem. The extent to which they are able to drive past or drive through those areas which perhaps have become dilapidated and aren't being looked after properly, and somehow blame it on the inhabitants and turn away, and these communities become heterogeneous.
That's probably a whole other discussion, but they're much more socially, physically integrated, the estates in Melbourne. A lot of them are those 5-storey walk-up models, or the models that I showed, these inner city terrace housing models. There aren't so many of those isolated estates, and the program from the 1980s onwards was to make sure they were socially, physically integrated into communities.
So you don't know that they're social housing?
No, that was the whole idea. They're not supposed to look like social housing from the 1980s onwards. But picking up on Mel's point about social dislocation and distance, I guess in the 19th century, as in now, people had very powerful modes of disavowal to disavow an ethical relationship to people who might be almost physically proximate to you. So one of the powerful systems that operated in the 19th century was to other the poor, to see them as less than human beings, to use language about them which made them sound that they were closer to animals than people. And there are still very powerful modes of othering to describe people that you imagine are not like you. So even with physical proximity, disavowal can happen, symbolic disavowal can happen, and language can be powerful. Which is why I think James' essays are fantastic, because you always meet the individual people who are in the front line of these larger political abstractions, and that it's like fiction writing. It's a process where you come to know someone and you empathise with them. So countering those systems, I think, of disavowal and how you make people who are not you intimate to you.
But I've always wondered about this. I've always found it strange that so many people do seem to find it easy to other the, in our country, historically, the people who live on council estates. Because in a way, it's a common home, it's the common landscape, it's the common cityscape. It's as if you had a garden in your house and half of it was wild and unkempt and full of old furniture, and you just sort of turned your back on it and sunned yourself on the neatly mowed lawn that you own. There's a question of extending your imaginative sympathy beyond that kind of pattern that you've gerrymandered to make yourself comfortable.
There's also other community institutions in which you meet people. So my son's school is a housing estate just across the road. So he goes to that school, all the kids from the neighbourhood go, including, we don't know, where anyone comes from. So they mix there, the kids mix at the local football team. So sports communities are a way of integrating people. School community integrates people. You go down to the local shop. So there are other facilities where you encounter people in public space and through these public activities, I guess.
Do we have any more burning questions in the room? Well, it's been an absolute pleasure to have two such sharp and articulate minds unpack such a complex, difficult subject. And can I ask everyone please to thank James Meek and Karen Burns.